Welcome to the school bus pre-inspection. I have the bus keys secured in my pocket. As I approach the bus, I am looking under the bus for any signs of leaks, such as oil, water, transmission fluid, power steering fluid, and antifreeze. After confirming there are no leaks, I will chalk the front and rear of the front passenger tire and make sure the bus is not leaning to the left or the right, which would indicate a suspension issue. Front of the bus from top to bottom. I will make sure the antenna is present, not cracked, broken, missing, or bent, and is securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. I would make sure the 3 amber lights are not cracked, broken, or missing, and they are securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. I would make sure the school bus reflector decal is not peeling, cracked, or missing, and it gives off good reflection and is legible and clean and is securely attached. I would inspect the 8-way student lights, making sure they are of the correct color, 2 amber and 2 red. I would make sure they are not cracked, broken, or missing, and they are securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. I would inspect the windshield, making sure it is clean and has no damage to the glass. I would make sure there are no illegal stickers or obstructions, and that the seals are intact, not dry rotted, and has no cuts or frays. I would make sure they are securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. Next, I would inspect the windshield wipers, making sure they are present and are not cracked or broken. This should be securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and the rubber is not dry rotted, cracked, or frayed, and makes good contact with the outside of the windshield. I would inspect the 2 crossover mirrors, making sure they are clean and properly adjusted with no illegal stickers or obstructions. I will make sure they are not broken, cracked, or missing, and have no damage to the glass. This should be securely mounted with no loose fittings and no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. I would make sure the wires are securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and the wires have no dry rot, cuts, or frays. Next, I would inspect the hazard and turn signals, making sure they are the correct color, amber in color, and they are not cracked, broken, or missing, and are securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. I would inspect the reflective tape and reflectors, making sure they are amber in color and are clean, in good condition, and gives off good reflection. I would make sure they are securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and they are not broken, cracked, or missing. I would also inspect the headlights, making sure they are clean and clear, not cracked, broken, or missing, and they are securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. I would inspect the grille, making sure it is not cracked, broken, or missing, and it is securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and no obstructions. I would inspect the crossing gate, making sure it opens and closes freely with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and is securely mounted. I would make sure it is not cracked, broken, or missing. I will make sure the boot is not cracked, frayed, or dry rotted, and is not leaking any air, and has a cotter pin in place and is securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. Next, open the hood. When inspecting under the hood, always start on the driver's side of the bus and touch each item. First, I would inspect the air lines, making sure they are not cracked, dry rotted, cut, or frayed, and there are no air leaks. They are securely attached and not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. I would inspect the power steering reservoir and dipstick, making sure it is securely mounted with no leaks and no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. I would make sure it is not cracked, broken, or missing with no illegal welds or dents. I will check the fluid level by pulling out the dipstick, wiping it off with a cloth, reinserting it, and pulling it back out. Levels should be in the safe operating range, which is at the refill line or above. I would check the hose from the power steering reservoir to the gearbox, making sure there are no cracks, frays, cuts, dry rots, or leaks. It is securely attached and all clamps and connectors are securely mounted. There should be no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. I would inspect the oil and transmission fluid dipsticks, making sure they are not cracked, broken, or missing, and has no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and no leaks. I would check the fluids by pulling out the dipstick, wiping it off with a cloth, reinserting it back into the tube, and pulling it back out. I would inspect the dipstick, making sure the level is within safe operating range, which is at the fill line or above. Engine oil should be checked when cold and the transmission fluid checked while running or hot. Next, I will inspect the air compressor and the power steering pump, which are located behind the frame at the bottom of the engine, making sure they are securely mounted and not leaking with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. I would make sure they are operating properly and are not cracked, broken, or missing, or have any illegal welds or dents. They are gear driven. Next, I would inspect my power steering components, starting with the power steering linkage, making sure it has no more than 2 inches of play when turned by hand, it is not cracked, broken, or missing, well greased, and not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. Next, I would inspect the gearbox, making sure it is securely mounted and that it is not cracked, broken, or missing, with no illegal welds or dents, and is not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. I would also inspect the 2 hoses that go to the power steering reservoir and the power steering pump, making sure they are secure with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and hoses have no leaks, cuts, dry rot, or frays, and clamps are securely attached. I will inspect the pitman arm, making sure it is not cracked, broken, or missing, and that it is secure, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws, and the castle nut and cotter pin are secure, not cracked or broken or missing. I would also inspect the drag linkage, making sure it is not cracked, broken, or missing. There are no illegal welds or dents, and it is mounted securely, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. Next, I would inspect the tie rod, making sure it is not cracked, broken, or missing, and it has no illegal welds or dents. It should be securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. I would make sure that the connection links, arms, and rods from the steering box to the wheels are not worn, cracked, broken, or missing. That the joints and sockets are not worn or loose and are well greased, and there are no obstructions. There are no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and everything is securely mounted. There should be no illegal welds, twists, dents, and no leaks. Next, I would inspect the leaf springs, making sure they are not missing, shifted, cracked, or broken, and the 2 mounts and U-bolts are not cracked, broken, or missing. No missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and it is securely mounted. The bushings should not be worn or loose, and there should be no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and should be securely mounted. This would be repeated on the other side. Next, I would inspect the shock absorber, making sure it is securely mounted, it is not cracked, broken, or missing, has no illegal welds or dents, and is not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws, having no leaks, and it is securely mounted. This would be repeated on the other side. Next, I would inspect the slack adjuster and push rod, making sure they are not cracked, broken, or missing, or have any illegal welds or dents. There should be no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, no leaks, and should be securely mounted. This would be repeated on the other side. Next, I would inspect the air brake chamber, making sure it is not leaking, cracked, broken, or missing, with no illegal welds or dents. It should be securely mounted, not missing any clamps, nuts, bolts, or screws. This would be repeated on the other side. Next, I would inspect the air brake hose lines, making sure they are securely mounted, not cracked, cut, frayed, or dry rotted. There should be no leaks, and the couplings should be securely attached. This would be repeated on the other side. Next, I would inspect the brake drum and the lining, making sure there are no cracks, dents, holes, or illegal welds. This should not be loose and not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. There should be no contaminants such as debris, oil, or grease, and the brake linings should not be worn dangerously thin. This would be repeated on the other side. Next, I would inspect the front driver's side tire, making sure the rim has no dents, cracks, or illegal welds, and no sign of rust on the inside or the outside of the rim. That would indicate the tire is separated from the rim. The side walls should have no cuts, bulges, or dry rot on the inside or the outside of the tire. The top of the tire should be smooth and evenly worn with a tread depth of no less than 4/32 of an inch. It should not be retreaded or recapped and only be replaced with new tires. The lug nuts are present and secure, not cracked, broken, or missing, with no rust trails or shiny spots around the lug nuts that indicate looseness. The hub seal should not be leaking, cracked, broken, or missing, with no cuts, frays, or dry rots. There should be no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. A screwdriver can be used to pop out the rubber seal to check the fluid level. I would check that the tire valve stem and cap are not cracked, broken, or missing, with no leaks. To check the tire pressure, I would take off the valve cap and apply the appropriate tire gauge on the valve stem and press the tire pressure gauge to read the pressure. You can find the tire's PSI on the side wall of the tire, which should read 120 PSI. If the tire pressure is low, then I would add air to get it to the appropriate pressure for that tire. If it is good, then I would replace the cap on the valve stem. This would be repeated on the other side. Passenger side inspection. Next, I would inspect the coolant reservoir and hoses. I would check the coolant level by removing the cap if it is cool, or the reservoir sight glass. I would make sure it is securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. It is not cracked, broken, or missing. I would ensure that the hoses are securely attached with no dry rot, cracks, frays, or leaks, and couplings are secure. Next, I would inspect the alternator, making sure it is securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. The wiring should be secure and connected with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. I would also inspect the water pump, making sure it is securely mounted with no leaks and not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. Both of these are belt driven, and I would check the belt for snugness, making sure it is not dry rotted, has no cuts, frays, or cracks. The belt should not give more than 1/2 to 3/4 inch in play to prevent slippage. They should both be operating properly and should not be cracked, broken, missing, or have illegal welds or dents. Next, I would make sure the exhaust manifold is not cracked, broken, or missing, with no signs of black soot that would indicate a leak. It is securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. Next, I will make sure the window washer fluid reservoir is not cracked, broken, or missing, and is securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, with no leaks, and it is at the proper level. Close the hood. Driver's side inspection of the bus. I would inspect the 3 clearance clip lights, reflectors, and turn signals. I would make sure they are the correct color: amber from the front of the bus to the back tire, and red from the rear tire to the rear of the bus for the lights and reflectors. I would ensure that all lens covers are clean, not cracked, missing, or broken, and not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws and are securely mounted. I would inspect the driver's side convex and flat mirrors, making sure they are not cracked, broken, or missing. I would make sure they are securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and the glass has no damage or illegal stickers. They should be clean with no obstructions, and the wires should be securely attached with no cuts, frays, or dry rot. Next, I would inspect the driver's side windows, making sure they are clean with no damage to the glass, no illegal stickers or obstructions. The emergency exit windows are properly labeled and legible, and the reflective tape is intact, not cracked or peeling, and gives off a good reflection when tested with a flashlight. Next, I would inspect the stop sign, making sure it opens and closes freely and is mounted securely with no loose fittings or missing nuts, bolts, or screws. All 4 red lights, 2 on the back and 2 on the front, should be clean, not cracked, missing, or broken, and should be the appropriate color of red. The red reflective sticker should be clean, securely mounted, not cut, peeling, or missing, and have good reflection. I will check the boot for damage, making sure it has no air leaks, cuts, frays, or dry rots, and the cotter pin is present. It should be securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. I would also inspect the cables, making sure they are securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, screws, and has no cuts or frays. Next, I would inspect the reflective tape, making sure it is not missing or peeling, and it is securely attached. It should be clean, functional, and in good condition, and gives off good reflection. Next is the fuse box, which should have 6 extra fuses. It is secure and only the maintenance department has access to it. Next, I would inspect the battery box, making sure that the batteries are secure with tight connections and all cell caps are present and secure. Batteries should have no signs of corrosion, and the safety pin should be in place with no obstructions on either side of the batteries. The battery box door is secure and opens and closes freely, and the hinges are in good working order. There should be missing no nuts, bolts, or screws. The driver's side inspection also include the under the bus inspection in front of the rear tire. While under the bus, I will inspect the longitudinal frame members, the cross members, and the floor and floor supports. I would make sure there are no cracks, broken welds, or holes, and it is securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, and screws. Next, I would inspect my drive shaft, making sure it is not bent, cracked, or twisted, or have any illegal welds. The couplings and hangers are secure and free of foreign objects. There are no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and they are securely mounted. The universal joints are well greased with no obstructions. They are securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. Next, I would inspect the exhaust pipe, making sure it has no holes, dents, twists, cracks, or illegal welds. There are no leaks. There should be no rust or carbon that would indicate a leak. It should be securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws, with no illegal welds or missing cotter pins, and all connections should be tight. Next, I would inspect the air brake chamber on both sides, making sure they are not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws, and the 2 clamps are present. And there should be no leaks, dents, or cracks, and no illegal welds. I would also inspect the air brake hose lines on both sides, making sure they are securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. They are not cracked, worn, or leaking, and the hose lines and couplings should be secured. There should be no dry rot, cuts, or frays. Next, I will inspect the shock absorbers on both sides, making sure they are securely mounted with no leaks, dents, twists, or illegal welds. There should be no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. If the bus is equipped with airbags, those would be inspected, making sure they are not missing, leaking, or damaged, and that they are securely mounted, not broken, or missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. This bus is not equipped with it, so it would not be necessary. Next, I would inspect the leaf springs on both sides, making sure they are not missing, shifted, cracked, or broken, with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and they are securely mounted. There should be no shiny spots indicating a shift. I would also make sure the two mounts and U-bolts are not cracked, broken, or missing, and they are securely mounted, missing no nuts, bolts, or screws. There should be no damaged bushings, and the bushings should not be worn or loose. Next, I would inspect the brake drums and linings on both sides, making sure they are not cracked or dented, and there are no holes or legal wells. There should be no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and they should be securely mounted. The brake linings are not worn dangerously thin, with no contaminants such as debris, oil, or grease. Next, I will inspect the slack adjusters and push rods on both sides, making sure they are not broken, cracked, or missing, with no illegal welds or dents. I will make sure they are securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. The push rod should not have more than 1 inch of play by hand with the brakes released. I would use a screwdriver to test this. Next, I would inspect the wheels and tires on both sides, making sure they are evenly centered with the dually tires evenly spaced, with no obstructions or debris. The tires should be smooth with even wear, and the tread depth should be no less than 2/32 of an inch. These tires can be retreaded or recapped. The side walls should have no cuts, bulges, or damage on the inside or the outside of the tires. The rims on the inside and outside should not be cracked, dented, or have any illegal wells. There should be no rust around the wheels, indicating the wheel and the tire have separation. The lug nuts should be present and secure, with no rust trails or shiny spots around the lug nuts, which would indicate looseness. The lug nuts are not cracked, broken, missing, and are securely mounted, and the axle seal is not leaking. The tire pressure should be 120 psi as indicated on the tire sidewall. I would test the tire pressure by removing the valve cap and applying the appropriate tire pressure gauge to the valve stem and read the pressure. If the pressure is low, then I would add air to get it to the appropriate tire pressure. If it is good, then I would replace the cap back onto the valve. I would make sure the valve stem and caps are not missing, broken, cracked, or leaking. Next, I would inspect the mud flap, making sure it is securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws, and that it is not cracked, broken, or missing, or not hanging loosely, and it is the appropriate length. Rear of the bus from top to bottom. Next, I would inspect all the lights, making sure they are of the appropriate color, amber, red, or white. 3 red clearance lights at the top, 2 8-way amber student lights, 2 8-way red student lights, 2 amber hazard flasher turn signals, 4 red brake and running lights, 2 white reverse lights, and 1 red caution stop light. I would ensure that all lens covers are clean and not cracked, missing, or broken. They should be securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. Next, I would inspect the 2 reflectors, making sure they are the appropriate color, red in color, also making sure they are not cracked, broken, or missing, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws, and they are clean and functional and has proper reflection. I would also inspect the school bus decal, making sure it is present, not cracked or peeling, and is securely attached to the bus. It should be legible and give good reflection. Next, I would inspect the rear door, making sure the glass is clean with no illegal stickers or obstructions and no damage to the glass. The doors should open freely from the outside, and the hinges and seals should be intact, not broken, cracked, or missing, and have no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. The seals should not be cracked, dry rotted, or frayed. The latches should work properly and be secured when closed. There should be 3 emergency triangles stored behind the back seat of the bus. The emergency exit should be properly labeled and legible. The exhaust should stick out further than the outside of the bus. Passenger side inspection. Next, I would inspect the fuel area, making sure the fuel door opens and closes freely. I would make sure the fuel cap and black seal are present, they're not missing, cracked, or broken, and there are no dry rots, cuts, or frays to prevent fuel spillage. I would ensure the fuel cap is tight and has no leaks or obstructions around the cap. I would also check the tank to make sure it is securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws, and there are no leaks under the bus. Next, I would inspect the DEF tank, making sure the lines are secure and not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws, and there are no leaks. The tank stays locked and the mechanics fill it. Next, I would inspect the clear loading light, making sure it is not cracked, broken, or missing, and it is securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. Next, I would inspect the entry door, making sure the glass is not cracked, broken, or missing, and it is clean with no illegal stickers or obstructions. It should open and close freely. The hinges should be secured, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws, and not cracked, broken, or missing. The seals should be intact and not hanging down loosely. There should be no cracks, frays, or dry rot. Next, I would inspect the handrails, making sure they are secure and not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. They should not be cracked, broken, or missing. Next, I would inspect the step light, making sure it is clear and white in color. It should not be cracked, broken, or missing. It is securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. I would verify the light works with the light check. Next, I would inspect the stairs, making sure the tread is not loose, cut, frayed, or worn. There is no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and there are no tripping hazards or debris. Next, I would inspect my emergency equipment, which consists of my fire extinguisher, making sure it is secure, properly charged and rated, the pin is intact, and it is green. I would make sure my first aid and body fluid kits are properly stocked in case of an emergency, and it is securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. Next, I would close the door with the emergency handle, making sure it operates smoothly and closes freely. Insert the key and turn it to the on position, but do not start the bus. Turn on the dome lights and strobe lights. Next, I would inspect the seats to make sure they are securely attached to the floor with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws. The seat bottoms should be secured to the seat frame and have adequate padding. I would also check the seat back to ensure it is securely mounted with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws and has adequate padding as well. I would check all the way to the back of the bus. Next, I would check the back emergency door, making sure it is properly labeled as an emergency exit and the label is present, not cracked, peeling, or missing, and is clean and legible. The door should open and close freely from the inside, and the emergency buzzer should sound when opened and goes off when closed. Next, I would inspect the emergency windows. They should have the proper state-approved labels indicating them as emergency windows. They are the only windows allowed to have stickers. They should open and close freely, with the buzzer sounding when open and goes off when closed. Next, I would inspect the 2 emergency roof hatches by turning the red knob to the exit and pushing on it. The hatch should open, causing the buzzer to sound. While the emergency hatch is open, I will ensure that the clear strobe light is working and is securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws, and it is the correct color, white in color. I would then connect the hatch back to the base of the roof and pull down, closing the hatch, which should cause the alarm to turn off, and then locking the red button in place. Next, I would inspect the dome lights, ensuring that they are securely mounted, not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws, and they are not cracked, broken, or missing. Now, I will take this time to indicate the student safety specific items. The student safety specific items are the stop sign and cross gate, the light lenses at the front and rear of the bus, the entryway, the step tread, the step light, the handrail, first aid and body fluid kits, the seats and mirrors. Driver compartment. Next, I would inspect the driver area. First, I would inspect the seat belt, making sure it is securely mounted on both ends and is easily adjustable with latches working properly and is not ripped, frayed, or cut. After taking the seat and putting on my seat belt, I would inspect the steering wheel, making sure it has no more than 2 inches of play when turned, and the horn works. As I crank on the bus, I am watching for the ABS light to come on and go back off, and all the gauges are working properly. Gauge inspection. I will make sure the oil pressure gauge is building to a normal range with no warning light. The normal range while idling is between 35 and 40 psi and between 50 and 60 psi while running. The temperature gauge should be within normal range and tells you if the bus is running normal or if it is overheating. The transmission temperature gauge is building to a normal range. The air pressure gauges are building to a normal range of between 100 to 125 psi with a governor cutoff rate at 120 to 140 psi. The voltmeter gauge indicates the alternator is charging and should be between 12 and 14 volts. The RPMs show your engine speed. The speedometer tells you how fast you're traveling. The fuel level shows how much fuel you have. The mileage shows how many miles your bus has driven. The clock indicates the time. The DEF gauge indicates how much DEF fluid you have. Next, I would turn on my headlights, which also turns on my clearance lights as well. The 3 to the front and 3 to the rear of the bus, and also the 3 going down each side of the bus. The gear shift should be in neutral. The parking light should be on and showing the parking brake is engaged. The interior or dome lights should be on, not cracked, broken, or missing, and not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. Next, I would check my mirrors while sitting in the driver's seat. I would adjust the left and right flat driver mirrors with the buttons used to operate those mirrors. I would then check the overhead rear view mirror, making sure it is properly adjusted and clean with no illegal stickers or obstructions. It should not be cracked, broken, or missing, mounted securely with no loose fittings or missing nuts, bolts, or screws. Next, I would inspect the windshield and wipers from the inside, making sure the washer fluid sprayer is working properly and the wipers, arms, and blades make good contact with the windshield and makes clean sweeps. They should be secure and not cracked, broken, or missing, and not missing any nuts, bolts, or screws. It should be working properly. Next, I would make sure the driver's fan operates properly on both the low and high. Next, I would inspect the heaters and defrosters, turning them on and confirming that they are functioning properly by using my hand to check airflow. Next, I would inspect my noise suppression button that turns off and on all unnecessary noises coming from the driver's compartment. This is used at railroad crossings. Light check confirmation. Next, I will check my lights, making sure that the switches correspond with the lights that are turning on. This can be seen in the dash interior light indicators and also by doing a walk around. Note: the examiner will assist in outside light check in front and to the back of the bus. Make sure each one is turned off after it has been checked. Make sure to point out each light. Once the examiner is off the bus, make sure the door is closed and open the driver window to communicate which light you are checking. First, start with the front of the bus. Left and right turn signals. Hazard lights or flashers, including front and sides. Headlights, high and low beams. Remembering the clearance lights are included, front and sides. 8-way amber student lights, 8-way red student lights. Also point out the stop sign, crossing gate, and open door when 8-way red lights are on. Repeat at the rear of the bus and include the tail light and brake lights and reverse lights, which should also include the backup sound. When the examiner gets back in the bus, point out the step light is working. It is clear in color and is not cracked, missing, or broken, and has no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and is working properly. Also, the clear loading light is clear in color and is not cracked, broken, or missing, with no missing nuts, bolts, or screws, and is working properly. Make sure to indicate to the examiner that while you were checking your reverse lights, you were also listening for the backup beeper and that you heard it, and that the red caution stop light comes on when the 8-way red student lights are activated. Turn on headlights, clearance lights, and strobe lights in preparation for your skill and driving test. We will now perform the brake checks. Parking brake check. First, I will make sure that all my wheels are chalked, then proceed to perform the parking brake check. I will confirm the air pressure has built to the governor cutoff rate of between 120 to 140 psi after hearing the actual cutoff. I will press the service brakes and change the gear from neutral to drive and release the service brake. I will then apply light pressure to the accelerator, confirming the parking brake holds, then returning the gear to neutral. The parking brake check is now complete. Next, we will perform the air brake check. I will confirm the air pressure has built to the governor cutoff rate of between 120 to 140 psi by hearing the actual sound of the cutoff. I would turn the engine off, then turn the key to the on position without starting the vehicle and release the parking brake. I will fully apply the service brake and hold for 1 minute, checking the air pressure gauge to see if the air pressure drops more than 3 psi in 1 minute. After that, I will release air pressure by fanning the service brake. The visual and audible warning signals should indicate the pressure has reached 60 psi. As I continue to release pressure by fanning the service brakes, the parking brake should pop out at approximately 40 psi. Service brake check. Next, I would perform the service brake check. I would start the engine, allowing the air pressure to build up. I will confirm air pressure has built to the governor cutoff rate of about 120 to 140 psi by hearing the actual cutoff sound. I would then remove my chocks and pull the bus forward at 5 miles per hour, then apply the service brakes and stop. I would check to make sure the vehicle does not pull from either side, which would indicate a brake problem, and that it stops appropriately. I am now confirming that the air pressure has built back up to the governor cutoff rate of 120 to 140 psi. All 3 brake tests are now completed.